So let's talk about the anatomy or design and layout of an ASP.NET MVC project. So these projects are set up in such a way where you have three primary pieces of functionality, and they're kind of segmented so that it's easy to identify and easy to manage. So let's start out by talking about that little acronym at the end of ASP.NET MVC, the MVC part. So MVC stands for Model View Controller. If you've done other programming in maybe different languages or different platforms, you may be familiar with the MVC or Model View Controller paradigm. And the idea is that your application is broken into three primary parts. You have the models, which are your classes. Those classes are modeling your real-world environment. So if you're building an application that is a online sales or point of sales application, then you would have things like products, orders, carts, users. Those would be your models. The controller is the piece that actually handles the logistics or the goings on within your application. So how is an order processed, or how is a customer's account created? The controller has all the logic to handle those scenarios. And then the last piece is the view. And the view for us can be thought of as a very smart HTML web page. So our views are where we actually do our layout. So that's where our CSS comes in, our HTML comes in. We actually mix some C# into those views because of the fact that we're actually doing things at a programmatic level. But what we're doing here essentially is that we're creating those web pages or views that would then interact with the controller, and the controller then uses the modules or models to do the work that needs to be done. So your controller, if you were creating an account, would take a user model and it would create that user model, and then it would save it to the database, and then maybe it would take that same model and then pass it to the view, the web page, to present the user's name, picture, email address, other information onto the screen so that the person actually working with your website can see that information. So they all work in something of a symbiotic relationship. You don't need every piece of the model every time, every piece of the ASP.NET paradigm every time. So sometimes you'll have cases where you're just dealing with controllers and models. You'll have cases where you're dealing with controllers and views without models. So there's a mix and match. Rarely have I ever come across a case where I don't need a controller. The controller is kind of the hub that actually handles the goings on within the app. So the controller is always important. You always will need a controller. Whenever you want to do something within your application, you either need to create a controller or go to an existing controller to get that work done. So that'll be your kickoff point probably about 80 to 90% of the time. Alright, so how does that look within the file structure of the ASP.NET app? So if we go through here, we have our solution, and a lot of this should look very familiar to what you learned in contemporary programming. So we have a solution, we have a project. And then inside of here we have our properties, which is our compiler properties, our references, which are our outside libraries, and these all come along for the ride automatically as part of us downloading or setting up that ASP.NET MVC template. Visual Studio downloads all of these references for us as NuGet packages. App data would be where you can store secure application data such as databases, XML documents, or even flat text files, and they're secured on the server so that they can't be browsed. App start is the folder where a lot of the app configuration kicks off or gets saved. We'll talk about these in later lectures, but for now, that is just kind of the meat and potatoes of that. Content is where you would store images. You can store CSS documents. All of those things that are static, that would not be edited, typically go under content. Controllers, that's the first piece of our MVC kind of model. So what we're looking at here, this is a home controller which handles deploying a home page. So you would add your controllers under the controllers folder for this project, and they all kind of share the same naming convention. It's whatever the name of the controller is. So in this case, this is the home controller, so we actually say home controller. You can have an account controller, which we'll make in later videos. You can also set up controllers for other different kinds of actions. So these controllers are what you'll use to do those mechanics in your app. If you have any fonts, web fonts that you want to deliver or deploy, you can put them under fonts. Models is where we'll build our own classes that we'll use for the application. So if we're creating a user class or an account class or a product class, that would be where we would put those classes. Scripts is where you would store things like JavaScript. So all of the JavaScript libraries that we're using in our application all live underneath scripts. Views is the last piece of our app. Now, Views is an interesting folder because you have a lot of different pieces going on in here. We have the Views folder itself, and then inside of it, you'll see a shared folder. And the shared folder is where all of the common layout elements will live. So underscore layout is the shell of your website. It's the Chrome is the kind of the technical term, but it's the overall layout and experience of your website. It's where your header, your navigation lives, your footer, and then any other common layout elements that you would see from page to page. They all live inside of this page, this underscore layout.cs HTML. Then for each one of our controllers that we have a corresponding views folder. So we have a home controller, and therefore we have a home folder. And inside of here, we have different pages. And each one of these pages is the other side of a controller action. And we'll talk more about that in a later video. But just keep that in mind, that when you create an action in a controller and you want that controller to generate a web page, you have to then create a view with that same name. So without going into my home controller, I can tell you that there's at least 3 actions inside of that home controller. One called index, one called contact, and one called about. Now each one of these views has a .cs HTML extension, and the reason for that is that these are a combination of CS, which is C#, and HTML. And these pages get compiled and turned into static HTML documents that the browser can read. So every time you create a controller action that generates a web page, you'll end up using one of these, you'll end up creating one of these views that actually generates the HTML content that ultimately ends up in the user's browser. So we have our views, we have a fav icon, which is just kind of a, not a standard, but I guess you could say a standard of content that's delivered to the browser. That's what gives you a custom icon in things like bookmarks and on your browser tabs. The global.asax is the kickoff point for your ASP.NET app. I like to describe this as the static void main of your application. So inside of here you have things like area registrations, global filters, routes, and bundles. If these look at all familiar to you, it's because you saw them earlier underneath the app start. So our bundle config, our filter config, and our route config actually get called inside of the application start, which is inside of the global ASAX. So this is where that kickoff, so to speak, happens with your application. Anything that you want to do that is a setup step or a getting started step all happens inside of global ASAX. Packages.config is a list of all of the NuGet packages that we're using inside of our application. So this is just a listing of them. These packages are managed by Visual Studio, so typically this is a file that's just used by Visual Studio to manage those packages. You don't need to touch it or edit it unless you run into issues, and then you jump in and you take care of it. The web config is the last piece of the app. So again, going back to contemporary programming with your Windows applications, you had an app.config file, which is where you stored things like connection strings or apps-based settings. This is the equivalent of that. Now, with Windows applications, when you compile them, they compile into exe files and they generate a config file that is whatever the name of the executable is, .config. With ASP.NET, our applications compile into DLL files, and then that web config stays as a web config. It never gets compiled into something else. So that becomes kind of a common file that you'll see across all ASP.NET MVC, or any ASP.NET application for that matter. They all end up getting generated as this web config, and that's where your config settings live. So with this all in place, we'll talk about each one of these pieces in more detail in later videos, but just so you have an understanding of what things are and where they live inside of your ASP.NET MVC application.